I'll just start by saying welcome to everyone here so far. Glad you could be here. This is an Autistic Voices First space. If you are not autistic, you are very welcome, but please leave the floor to people who don't get a chance to do these kinds of things very often in community where we are actually experiencing the world together and experiencing our culture, building our cultural experiences together. So thank you for that respect. And also a reminder, you could please just make sure that you hit the mute button, make sure you're on mute. For sure, for those of us who have auditory processing challenges, background noise is very distracting, and it'll also kick the speaker off and put your face on the page. So if you could just ensure your mute button is on, that would be great. And is the case with most of our esteemed guests, we ask that you hold your questions until after the information is provided. So there's no break in concentration for Sanjay. And the additional thing I would say today is that I'm just so proud of Sanjay. It is difficult work being an autistic person, adhering to the language of the power structure and trying to do good for our tribe, uh, using the language and the means of the power structure. And so our hats off definitely to Sanjay. And today we can listen to this very interesting, information packed presentation. I got a taste of it when we went through it the other day. There's just so much to learn. And so our feedback can be really positive and supportive about the things we can contribute as Sanjay goes forth to do good things for our community.
All right. Okay. All right. Everybody see, can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I think there we go. That should be fine. And people can just see the PowerPoint slide on screen right now. Okay, all right. Then I think in that case I'm ready to go. All right. So good afternoon. My name's Sanjay Kumarendran, and my pronouns are they, them. So today I'm going to be speaking about the research that I've been helping with here at the Yale Child Study Center to try and understand the relationship between sensory processing and irritability in autistic teenagers. So before we start, I thought I'd share a little bit about myself. So, my own experiences as an autistic child have really been like a large driving force, like an impetus in my desire to become an autism researcher. So, ever since I was 17, I decided that this was what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And, that with that goal in mind, that has driven me to write about a lot of the different intersections between the autistic identity and experience and current issues in society. So, I've written about how autistic people might experience the workplace and how autistic whistleblowers in particular who report wrongdoing at work might be adversely affected by that in particular. I've also written about what helps to support psychological well-being in autistic people. I've written about phenomena like masking and camouflaging, and I've also written a little bit about gender diversity and how that might intersect with autism in interesting ways. So I also wanted to note as well, for me, there's not really a meaningful separation between my life as a researcher and my life as an activist and organizer, here in the city of New Haven. Part of my firm conviction and like my values as a researcher is that we need to go beyond the work that we do in the lab and in academia, and we need to kind of extend the commitments to the communities we research to everyday life, and we need to show up for them in everyday contexts in the workplace, and just to make sure that they're being supported and that they have the material conditions that they need to flourish. Now, I was very lucky because, as I mentioned, I grew up as an autistic child and I had access to support and interventions, which not necessarily all autistic people do. And for that, I owe a lot of thanks to my parents. And, I think in particular, my mom, who is my greatest friend and my closest academic collaborator to this day. So when I was 2, I was diagnosed with autism myself, and my mom quit her job as a doctor so that she could take care of me full time. And together with my dad, she made sure that I had access to evidence-based therapies and interventions, and she drew upon her expertise and background in medical science to review the literature. She worked directly alongside behavior technicians and psychologists to make sure that the program was effective. And it's partly thanks to her that I'm able to live independently of caregiver support as an adult, let alone to be studying at Yale or speaking to all of you today. And now, as I'm an adult, my mum and I still remain very close friends with each other, and we both learn a lot from each other, not just on a personal level, but also an academic one. So, with both of my parents, in fact, I often reach out to my mum and my dad to critically discuss the latest developments in autism research, and I find that, both of my parents have a very keen eye for detail and a very healthy skepticism towards the very kind of grand, oversimplified claims that a lot of researchers make. So, before I properly start the presentation, I just wanted to give a quick note. So, obviously, I am a researcher, I have background knowledge on this topic, but that doesn't mean everything I say is right. I make mistakes. So, with that in mind, what I've done here is I've listed my email address here, and I will be listing it again at the end of the presentation. So, that way, if any of you would like to kind of reach out to me via email, you can request the PowerPoint slides that I'm showing you today. And that also includes a full list of sources and references at the end, and that allows anyone in the audience to follow up on the claims I make. So if you think, oh, hey, like, I don't know if that sounds quite right, you can look at the reference that I've cited to support that claim, and then you can go and look into that reference for yourself to see if I've correctly backed up what I've said. I encourage this attitude of transparency, and I encourage anyone in the audience to challenge and question me at the end of the presentation, because I just want to be a researcher with good academic integrity, and part of that process is accepting and listening to constructive criticism. So, with all of that being said, I'm going to start off this presentation by asking you to put yourself in the shoes of an autistic woman named Deborah. So, imagine for a moment that you're Deborah and you're walking through a department store during the holiday season and you can see flashing lights throughout the store. You can smell strong, pungent fragrances and colognes, and you can hear the excited chatter of people all around you. As you try to walk through the hustle and bustle of people squeezing themselves down crowded, busy aisles, you start to feel overwhelmed. But suddenly, you notice something mesmerizing, something colorful and shiny, ornaments and tinsel on the trees. You're transfixed by these colorful, shiny objects, and so you move closer. Despite the strong, captivating power of these shiny trinkets, you're still registering the increasingly overwhelming sensory information around you, and when you're finally able to refocus on your surroundings, you're about to have a sensory meltdown. And yet you didn't notice it because you were so focused on the shiny objects. The distress in this personal account highlights an important truth. For many autistic people, there can be a lot of stress involved in even everyday experiences because sensory stimuli, which other people might find completely normal, can feel overwhelmingly painful or distressing for them. On the other hand, many autistic people can have a strong desire to seek out certain kinds of sensory stimuli, and these seemingly contradictory impulses and feelings can happen even at the very same time, like this story illustrates. So the story I just told was a real one from Deborah Lipsky, an autistic educator, medical technician, and former firefighter. In her book, From Anxiety to Meltdown, she recounts her own difficult experiences of overwhelming sensory stimuli and offers tips on how to help other autistic people with these experiences. Even for autistic people who are seen as having low support needs or to be able to live independently, sensory issues can still be distressing. In fact, sometimes the needs of autistic people who live independently of caregiver support and have careers can be overlooked because they're assumed to be capable of just stopping what they're feeling, or are accused of choosing to be difficult or attention seeking. In fact, just nothing could be further from the truth. And in today's presentation, we'll try to understand how sensory processing issues can affect all kinds of autistic people, and autistic teenagers in particular, and can lead to irritability, which may in turn lead to meltdowns and other problems. We'll be looking at a study that was conducted here at the Yale Child Study Center, specifically the Sukadolsky lab, to try and understand how sensory processing and irritability might be linked. So, Before we go any further, it's important to be clear about what we're talking about here. So, what do we mean when we say irritability? Well, the best way to define it is as a reduced threshold for anger caused by frustration. So, basically, just finding that you're quicker to feel angry if something frustrates you. It's really important not to mix this up with aggressive behavior because it's definitely possible to experience irritability without behaving aggressively towards others. Anyone who's ever been irritated at their teacher or their parents or their boss but just chosen not to act upon it will definitely know that. Because you might know that you'll get into trouble or that acting aggressively won't really fix the situation, or you just might not want to hurt somebody else. Still, irritability can lead to aggression, even if it doesn't always. So it's important for us to understand why it occurs and what leads to autistic teenagers becoming irritable. And then in that way, we can reduce behaviors which could be harmful to themselves and others, but not by punishing or manipulating, but just trying to help them manage their emotions before it gets to the point of losing control. Anyone can become irritable, of course, but prevalence appears to be higher among autistic people, with an estimated 19 to 80% of autistic children being affected by irritability. That does sound like quite a large variation in the estimated prevalence, and part of the reason why is because it depends on which samples of autistic people we look at and which measurement tools we use. So, why are autistic children and teenagers more likely to experience irritability? Truthfully, for the most part, we still don't know, but emerging evidence suggests that irritability can be associated with sensory differences in autism. This would make sense because we know that autistic people across all age groups often process sensory information differently from neurotypical people, and that this can be distressing at times. In fact, estimates from existing studies suggest that up to 90% of autistic people can experience sensory processing issues. There are different types of sensory issues which can affect autistic people: hypersensitivity, which means being more responsive to sensory stimuli, and hyposensitivity, which means being less responsive to sensory stimuli. So these can occur across all senses: smell, touch, taste, sound, and sight. And both hyper and hyposensitivity can make life harder for autistic teenagers, as they can lead to distress, self-injury, and stimulation-seeking behaviors which can cause problems for peer relationships, as well as potentially missing social cues which can be important for conversation. So, a link between sensory processing differences and irritability could partly explain autistic meltdowns. And these are distressing episodes where an overwhelming situation causes an autistic person to feel emotionally dysregulated, which can lead to aggressive behaviors which hurt themselves or others. Meltdowns could be explained by environmental stimuli causing sensory overload in autistic people, heightening frustration and in turn causing aggressive outbursts. However, it's hard to say at this point whether this is the case because we don't have a lot of research on this, and that's where our study aims to fill the gap. It's also important to note that meltdowns aren't the same as tantrums, which is something I'll discuss later in the presentation, because the conflation of meltdowns with tantrums has been very harmful and stigmatizing to the autistic community. So, when we've tried to study irritability before, what problems have we faced? Well, there tend to be lots of inconsistencies in reports of irritability. Studies on neurotypical participants have found that there are big differences between how parents rate their own child's irritability and how the child reports the irritability themselves. Whatever is going on in the brain, we need strong information and data from teenagers and their families to be able to support autistic teenagers with irritability and sensory processing differences. Inconsistencies between parent and child reports can be concerning, but they're actually useful data because they help us to understand where parents might be missing out on data about their teenage autistic children. This is really important because parents are usually the ones who gatekeep or decide what care and support their kids can access, even when they become older as teenagers. So, we decided to use both parent and adolescent reports of irritability for that very reason, because we wanted to understand how the parents of autistic teenagers might view their children's irritability differently from the teenagers themselves. We also wanted to understand how parents of autistic teenagers might view the link between sensory processing and irritability differently from the teenagers themselves. And this work is important because most of the previous research that's looked at that link between sensory issues on the one hand and irritability on the other has mainly focused on younger autistic children rather than adolescents or teenagers. And we might see different findings for teenagers because we know that adolescence is a time when there's a lot of development and there's a lot of change, and that might kind of change the way in which teenagers respond to sensory stimuli compared to, say, how a younger autistic child might respond. We also wanted to understand whether we could make a prediction about how irritable an autistic teenager might feel based on what they tell us about their sensory experiences. So, before I go any further into explaining the research, it's important for me to kind of clarify or explain a few terms which aren't always well defined or understood. And I should be clear, it's not just the mainstream media or the general public that misunderstands these terms. Quite often, researchers have been found to misuse these terms and to misrepresent their meaning in studies published in well-respected journals. So I think it's important to notice that researchers are just as prone to kind of falling prey to misconceptions about scientific terminology. So, the first term I want to clear up is what I just said about predicting irritability. It's important to be clear that when we're trying to predict something, we're not necessarily saying anything about what causes anything else. So, when I say that we try to predict self-reports of irritability among autistic adolescents from their self-reported sensory processing, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily saying their sensory processing experiences are what caused the irritability. They might have caused the irritability, but we can't tell that from our study, since we only collected data from one point in time, and therefore we can't say which came first, the sensory processing or the irritability. All we can tell is how likely might be based on the other. And another term you'll hear me use today is statistical significance, or I might just abbreviate it to significant. In everyday conversation and writing, you might hear people using that term to mean that something is important or noteworthy, but when we use that term in a scientific or statistical context, that isn't what it means. All it really means is that if we find a significant result, there is a small chance of the true effect being zero. But just because it's very likely that there's an effect, it doesn't mean that it's a large effect. So, for example, a baldness cure could technically be statistically significant if there was a little bit of fuzz, which covered the previously naked scalp. That would mean that there was a true effect, but just a very small one. But I think, most customers looking for a baldness cure would agree that the cure would only be practically significant when a hat is no longer needed in cold weather and, your barber asks you how much to take off the top. So now that we've got that out of the way, how did our study work? Well, the data collection was already done by the time I arrived at Yale, but very helpfully, my colleagues attended autism community events, promoted the study through social media platforms like Facebook, and reached out to clinicians who work with autistic teenagers. And in the end, 56 autistic adolescents aged between 12 and 19 took part in the study. They came to our lab with their parents to fill out some questionnaires which we could use to gain a sense of how they might experience sensory processing and irritability. And you might ask, what measures did we use? Well, to measure the different types of sensory experiences they have, we used a measure called the Adolescent Adult Sensory Profile, which the adolescents filled out themselves. To measure irritability, we used a measure called the Affective Reactivity Index, which parents and children filled out. I'll now explain a little bit more about these measures. So, firstly, the adolescent or adult sensory profile. This is a self-report measure consisting of 60 items, designed for anyone aged between 11 and 65, and it asks the person filling out the questionnaire about the different types of experiences they might have with sensory stimuli and how they respond to them. This is done by giving them a series of statements and asking them to say how often they respond in that way, on a 5-point scale ranging from almost never to almost always. So, for example, you could see the statement, I add spice to my food, and you might tick that you occasionally add spice to your food. The items on the AASP are equally split into 4 different categories, which aim to measure different experiences of sensory processing. So there's 15 items for each category. I'll now explain a little bit about these different types of sensory processing that the scale aims to measure. So, low registration means missing or taking longer to respond to sensory stimuli, which others are quicker to notice. So, for example, an item for this quadrant would be, I don't smell things that other people say they smell. Brown and Dunn, who are the researchers who developed this scale, believed that scoring highly in low registration meant that somebody had a high neurological threshold, meaning that it takes more stimulation before the neurons in their brain fire in response to a sensory stimulus. They also characterized this as a passive response because it involves noticing rather than doing. So, sensation seeking involves creating additional stimuli or seeking out environments that provide a lot of stimulation. So, for example, an item on the AASP which would measure this response would be, I add spice to my food. Now, Brown and Dunn believed that this indicated a high neurological threshold because somebody would need to seek out more sensory stimulation in order to create the level of sensory stimulation that they're looking for. However, unlike with low registration, they characterize this as an active rather than passive response because it involves doing and not just noticing. So for sensory sensitivity, that indicates fast and responsive reactions to sensory stimuli, which can result in a high level of attention to detail, but it can also lead to distraction and discomfort because stimuli can feel especially intense. Somebody with high sensory sensitivity might answer almost always to the AASP item, I startle easily to unexpected or loud noises. Now, Brown and Dunn believed that this indicated a low neurological threshold because less stimulation was needed before the neurons are fired in the brain. However, they also characterized this as a passive response because it involved noticing rather than doing. Sensory avoiding means being easily overwhelmed by sensory stimuli and therefore actively trying to reduce the sensory stimuli in your environment. So, for example, someone who scores highly for sensory avoiding might agree strongly with the statement that they wear gloves to avoid activities that will make their hands messy. Now, this also indicates a low neurological threshold because it's about needing less stimulation before you start to respond. But in this case, the response is an active rather than a passive one because it involves actively going out of your way to do something about that. So, how does the ARI, which was our measure of irritability, work? So, we use this scale, and it exists in a form that can be reported by both parents and children, and that's known as the ARIP for parents and the ARIC for children. Now, in both its forms, this is a seven-item scale which asks questions about the emotional state of irritability, not behaviours, and participants are asked to express how true a given statement is about them. Child self-report or parent report is used, and the only difference is that the wording is changed from you to your child. You can see all the items on screen, but an example statement from the scale would be stays angry for a long time. And if you look at the items on screen, you'll notice that they all share something in common. While they describe the mood of being irritable, none of them describe direct aggressive behaviors towards other people. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, irritability and aggressive behavior aren't the same thing. And the authors who devised this measure, Stringaris and their colleagues, were very careful to make sure that they didn't mix up irritability with aggressive behavior. So, before I move on to our key findings, I'm going to briefly show the analyses on the screen. There's quite a lot of technical detail here, which I won't be going into today just to save time, but I wanted to show you the analyses that I used for transparency and so that you can see the process I used to arrive at my results. And if you'd like to learn any more about this, feel free to email me afterwards, and I'd be happy to send over the slides for more information and answer any questions at all you have about the statistical analyses that we use to arrive at these results. So, there were a few key findings. Now, firstly, the sensory processing variables measured by the AASP appeared to predict a significant proportion of the expected values of irritability. Second, specific AASP quadrants, the low registration and the sensory sensitivity quadrants, were especially strongly associated with irritability. However, seeking out sensory stimuli or sensation seeking wasn't associated with irritability at all, which might make sense because if someone is seeking out lots of sensory stimuli, they're presumably not easily irritated by stimuli in the environments around them. We also found that what the autistic teens said about their own experiences of sensory processing on the AASP had significant correlations with what they said themselves about their irritability on the ARI. That is, except for sensation seeking, which would again make sense, since seeking out stimuli which someone finds irritating would be quite an odd thing to do. However, what the autistic teens said about their experiences of sensory processing didn't have significant correlations with what their parents said about their teenage children's irritability. This might suggest that autistic teens can pick up on the link between sensory processing and irritability, where autistic parents can't, and this is potentially really meaningful and useful data for doctors and psychologists to support autistic teenagers and their parents, because if parents aren't aware of the sensory issues that their children are facing, that could prevent them from receiving the support that they need. So, what questions were we not able to answer with the current research? Well, like I said earlier, our research wasn't able to tell us much about whether sensory processing differences necessarily cause irritability. Though it's still not a perfect method, future research could get closer to this by collecting data about the same group of autistic teenagers as they get older. And then that way we can tell what comes first and what comes after, whether it's irritability first, and that causes the sensory processing atypicalities, or whether the sensory processing atypicalities or causes irritability, or indeed if neither of them cause each other and there are other variables that explain the relationship between both of them. Now, in the current study, we used a technique called hierarchical regression. You don't really need to worry about what that is right now, but the point is to produce results which we can feel confident about when we're using a hierarchical regression, we need a sample size of at least 145 people. Now, in the current study, we only had 56 people, which is obviously quite a lot less than this. Now, this increases the likelihood that our results were a false positive. That is, that being able to predict predict irritability from sensory processing as we did in this study, that might not have been observed if we'd used a larger sample with more participants. And therefore, future research should try to recruit more participants and see whether the sensory processing variables predicting irritability is still something that happens when we use a larger sample size. Now, to make inferences about what might be causing which variable over time, we'd also need to use some more complex statistical models, even more complex than hierarchical regression. And what we tend to find is that the more complex a statistical model becomes, in terms of trying to tell which variable causes another, we tend to need more participants in order for the statistical test to produce valid results. So we would need even more participants than we would need for a hierarchical regression. So recruiting more participants here would be a win-win because it would allow these findings to be more generalizable to the autistic population in general, and it would also ensure that the statistical tests that we want to conduct would give good, robust results. As well as thinking critically about our statistical analyses and our sample size, it's also important for us to think critically about the measures we used in this study. These were all questionnaire measures, rather than objective biological measures like brain activity or heart rate, which might make them biased. Brown and Dunn believed that the different quadrants in the AASP were recording information about how quickly someone's brain might respond, but we actually really can't tell that from the questionnaires alone, since they're just asking people about what we think they might be feeling. However, the affective reactivity index is a very useful measure for our purposes because it measures irritable mood rather than aggressive behavior, and it therefore aligns with calls from the autistic community for researchers to consider autistic patients' root causes of distress rather than just trying to manipulate, control, or remove behaviors. We know that irritability frequently causes distress to the person feeling it, even when they don't act out in aggressive ways towards other people, especially since repressing anger can actually make physical discomfort worse. By capturing irritable mood independently of disruptive behaviors, our research can help to develop interventions which try to reduce the anger that autistic teenagers are experiencing, rather than just trying to remove aggressive behaviors without considering why the autistic person is feeling angry in the first place. Now, the AASP has already been criticized by other researchers for the fact that it might measure things other than pure sensory processing, say, for instance, anxiety. And this is an important distinction because even where an autistic person has especially high sensitivity to sensory stimuli, that still occurs in response to a specific environmental trigger. An anxiety, on the other hand, is characterized by a prolonged, chronic, and ongoing state of worry that is not necessarily a response to a specific stimulus or a specific event. It tends to be a kind of higher baseline state of vigilance. So, for instance, here are a few items on the AASP which might accidentally mix up sensory issues with anxiety. So this item here, I'm afraid of heights, that might instead measure acrophobia, which is an anxiety disorder characterized by excessive and ongoing fear of heights. And that would be different from sensory processing issues because acrophobia is chronic and ongoing, and it occurs when somebody is thinking about or anticipating heights as well as while experiencing them. And that's quite different from having a sensory response to a specific stimulus involving heights. Meanwhile, the question on that says I move away when others get too close to me could instead indicate social anxiety. And the reason why that is because there have previously been studies done on people with social anxiety where it's there's two different types of stimuli used. On the one hand, there's a neutral object placed near them, and there's like a social stimulus, like, kind of an image of a person they might potentially have to interact with. And what those previous studies have found is that people with social anxiety will overestimate how close the person is standing to them, but they won't overestimate how physically close an inanimate object is to them. And what that suggests is that they're perceiving that the person is standing closer to them than they really are, but they won't do that with other objects that are inanimate or that don't have anything to do with social situations. Essentially, they have a distance estimation bias, but that distance estimation bias only applies to social stimuli or to people and not to inanimate objects. And that's a really important distinction to make, because if you don't have a distance estimation bias with non-social stimuli, is it really a difference in visual processing? I'd argue not really. I would say that that is a difference in response to social stimuli, not a difference in how your visual sensory processing works. Now, what can we do with all of our research? I've obviously laid out a lot of critiques, and that might sound a bit disappointing because it might sound like our research, isn't directly and immediately applicable now. But I think that's just part of the process of doing research. No study is perfect, and every study offers something of value for future researchers to build upon. By being the first to use these measures in this way, that is the AASP and the ARI, this is one of the first studies to use hierarchical regression to look at that relationship between them, we've now offered a template for future researchers to build on our work. The discrepancies between parents and autistic adolescents are especially useful information, and future work could try to see whether these patterns of discrepancy are similar across different samples of autistic teenagers or whether they're not. We could also try to understand why these discrepancies might be occurring. For example, we know that mental health issues can be more common among the parents of autistic teenagers because they might be dealing with the stigma that can come with raising an autistic child due to societal ableism. And in turn, those mental health issues might make it harder for the parents of autistic teenagers to notice issues that their teenage children are facing. So, for example, previous research has found that parents who experience higher anxiety themselves might be more likely to overestimate how much anxiety their autistic child is experiencing. So, it's possible that we might find that parental mental health also plays a role in the ability of parents to accurately understand what their autistic children are going through in terms of sensory processing and irritability. By understanding the role of the familial environment, future research could encourage societal change and better support structures for parents and families to help their autistic teenage children. So, what do we need to look into from here? Well, literature suggests that irritability improves with age among autistic adolescents, but still tends to remain higher than their neurotypical counterparts. And future research might help us to close this gap between neurotypical and autistic adolescents by identifying how we can further support these decreases in irritability over time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this current research only used data from one point in time. We did, however, actually conduct some follow-up research where we looked at the same group of autistic teenagers and looked at them after they'd received some therapy to help them reduce their irritability. So, by looking at these follow-up findings, we might be able to tell whether that therapy was effective. However, we chose not to look at those findings for this particular study because what we were interested in for this particular analysis was the relationship between sensory processing and irritability before any therapies have been given. And then that way we can, for this particular analysis, we can have findings that are more generalizable to autistic teenagers who haven't had these therapies yet, which is important to understand because not every autistic teenager can access these kinds of therapies, whether due to geographical or financial restrictions. However, when we analyze these findings that we collected at a later point in time, we'll hopefully be able to understand whether that therapy was effective. Now, despite the fact that irritability seems to reduce over time among autistic adolescents as they get older, studies have shown that autistic female adolescents, or assigned female at birth, they seem to experience persistently high levels of irritability compared to autistic AMAB adolescents, or assigned male at birth. Now, there are various explanations for that. It's possible that, autistic women, girls, or transmasculine people might face a double hit from both the autism diagnosis and being born female, which could lead to unique stresses like masking, which could in turn worsen emotional issues. Alternatively, or additionally, societal expectations of girls and women to be well behaved may make irritability more noticeable and pronounced when parents are describing the irritability that they believe their children are going through. Now, these offer a lot of useful and very interesting directions for future research, but naturally, in the meantime, many people may be asking, what do we do about this? Because research takes a long time to complete, it takes a long time to improve upon, and in the meantime, autistic teenagers still need our help and they still need our support. Well, to start with, it's important that we make a distinction between meltdowns and tantrums. And there's some confusion between these terms, and that can be very stigmatizing for autistic teenagers because something that they experience as involuntary, a fight or flight response to sensory stimuli, is often instead framed as deliberate, manipulative, or attention seeking. So, to make this clearer, we can break down some key differences between meltdowns and tantrums. We can again turn to Deborah Lipsky for her advice on handling this. Now, I should note before I go any further that I am a researcher, not a clinician. So if you work with autistic teenagers and children yourself, I'd also encourage you to look into your organization's guidelines and critically assess the current evidence on best practice. What I'm about to share is intended as a prompt to encourage further reading and curiosity rather than as professional clinical advice. Now, with that said, some important distinctions between meltdowns and tantrums are that meltdowns involve cognitive dysfunction and are completely involuntary. Tantrums, on the other hand, do not involve cognitive dysfunction and are always a choice. In fact, they're often deliberately manipulative. Now, it's important to note that, autistic teenagers, just like any other teenagers, they can be manipulative, they can be sneaky. None of us are perfect people. But, autistic people aren't necessarily any more likely to do that than neurotypical teenagers are. It's just something that, all kids and teenagers can be like that at times. Now, with that said, another important difference is that meltdowns are prolonged. They go on, and they just cannot be stopped until the thing that caused the stress is removed or until the autistic person is just taken out of the environment that caused them to experience such intense sensory distress. Tantrums, on the other hand, tend to be shorter, and they can be stopped as it's not the result of a fight or flight response on a neural level. Meltdowns represent a completely uncontrolled response to a stressor, and as such, you'll often see an autistic person having a meltdown who will be flailing around and moving their limbs in very uncontrolled ways, involving lots of, muscle spasms and visible, tangible signs of anxiety. A person who's having a tantrum might also engage in very vigorous movements, but you'll be able to tell the difference by noticing that these movements are more targeted, more controlled, and are directed towards specific people. Now, meltdowns will never involve bargaining because the person who's in that situation will simply just not be in a cognitive state where they're able to think on the level of, oh, well, if you do this, then I'll do this, or if I do this, then you'll do this. They're just not capable of thinking on that level because what they're feeling is such an overwhelming state of distress that they just can't think like that. Tantrums, on the other hand, often do involve bargaining. So, for instance, a child, whether autistic or neurotypical, who doesn't want to eat their Brussels sprouts at dinner, they might say to their parent, "Oh, oh, is it if I just eat one Brussels sprout, can I have my dessert?" They'll try to kind of like bargain and like move the terms of the agreement. And that's what a really crucial distinction between a meltdown and a tantrum is. Now, meltdowns can, as I noted in the introduction, they can be aggressive and they can involve, self-injury or injury towards other people. But it's important to note that when an autistic person is in a sensory meltdown, they are never trying to be violent. They are never trying to hurt anyone. What they are experiencing is a state of distress where they are perceiving the world around them as a threat to their existential survival. So, when aggressive behaviors towards other people occur in a meltdown, this will only occur if somebody enters the personal space of the autistic person while they are having the meltdown, because that causes that person to be perceived as a threat, regardless of what their intentions are. So I think it's important to note that, even if an autistic person injures somebody in a meltdown, it was not because they were intentionally trying to hurt that person, and it was not something they were doing willfully. With that said, the aggression that occurs in a tantrum is completely different because that is targeted aggression against a person who is setting boundaries and limits, saying, no, you can't have this or you can't do this right now. And then the response to that is aggression because the person having the tantrum perceives that if they are aggressive enough, they might be able to kind of bully or coerce the other person into doing what they want. So while both meltdowns and tantrums can involve aggression, the aggression is of a completely different nature and should be understood as such. The aggression in meltdowns, just to summarize, is involuntary. It is not targeted towards a specific person. It is a perceived survival mechanism to intrusions of personal space, while the aggression in tantrums is intended to be manipulative and controlling. Now, naturally, with there being this distinction between tantrums and meltdowns, it also has important implications for how we respond to them and how we intervene. So if you see a child, or a teenager having a tantrum, regardless of whether or not they're autistic or neurotypical, it's important to be consistent and set a limit and be firm about sticking to that limit. Because if you try to argue or bargain or reason with a child or teenager who's having a tantrum, it really just sends the message to them that they can kind of like pressure you or bully you into doing what they want. And that's not okay. Because it's not, how as adults, regardless of whether we're autistic or neurotypical, it's just not how we want to conduct ourselves in relationships with other people. Now, in terms of, like explaining behaviors, this is also really important. It's important to explain why, if you have a consequence, like, oh, you did this thing, so like, you were aggressive, and then therefore, let's say, PlayStation for a week or something like that. It's also important to explain why a certain action is being met with a certain consequence. So it would be important to say something like, "We are not letting you play the PlayStation for a week because hurt this other child on the playground, not just say that we're not letting you have PlayStation for a week." And what we should avoid doing is just ordering the person to do something without saying why. Because then the child or the teenager, they just think, well, what was even the reason that I should be punished in this way? We should develop a plan for aggressing aggressive behavior during tantrums and just make it absolutely clear that aggression is not acceptable. We should never try to give in to the person's demands to try and reduce their aggression. So, say, a teenager or a child has a tantrum because they can't get what they want. If you give them what they want in response to having a tantrum, that can often reinforce the aggressive behavior because it sends them to them the message that they can get what they want through aggression. Now, just to be really clear, these intervention strategies should not be used with meltdowns at all, because meltdowns are not voluntary, they are not manipulative. As I mentioned before, they're an involuntary response to sensory stimuli. So, when you see an autistic person having a sensory meltdown, your first priority should be to ensure the safety of everyone involved. You should maybe aim to like kind of like block doors and things like that because potentially, say, if the autistic person having a meltdown runs out into the street, they could, get hurt. They could get hit by a car because they're not in a state where they are responding. They are reacting. And, but it's important to notice that when you're attempting to kind of do that, you should never use physical restraints on an autistic teenager or an autistic child. That will only increase the risk of injury to oneself and the person having the meltdown. You should aim to really locate the sensory stressor or the trigger that induced the meltdown and quickly reduce the stimulation level as quickly and safely as possible. Or if it's not under your control to reduce the stimulation that caused the meltdown, you should do everything in your power to help that autistic child or teenager out of the situation that is distressing them. Now, you also shouldn't try to offer solutions before you know they are available, because if you say that you're going to provide something that is a source of comfort and you're not able to provide it because you've lost it, say, for instance, for many autistic people having a meltdowns, a comfort item can be something that is able to somewhat regulate the state of distress they're in. It won't remove it, but it'll somewhat regulate it. So if you say to, an autistic child or autistic teenager, I'm going to go and get you that stuffed toy that I know calms you down, and then you don't have it, you've lost it, you're not 100% confident you have it. actually better not to say that you're going to go and get it, because what you do when you say that you're going to go and get it and then you don't get it is you send the message that your reassurance can't be trusted, and that will, that will be experienced by the autistic person as a violation of trust. And then not only does that harm them in the moment, it means that in future, if you're ever trying to reassure them during a meltdown, they might think, oh well, this person's reassurance isn't worth anything because they told me last time that they would be able to offer me this comfort item and they just weren't, they didn't have it. Now, in terms of like, preventing injury to the person, it's important to just address the problem at hand. And, as I mentioned earlier, we really shouldn't use physical restraints. So the question then is, how do we deal with this? Well, we quietly approach the person, being very, very careful not to startle them because they're in a very elevated state of anxiety and stress. And we should just try to place a soft object like a pillow between the person and like a physical surface to prevent them from hurting themselves. So, if they're head banging or anything like that, it's just about kind of trying to quietly intervene to make sure you can reduce the likelihood of injury. Now, you shouldn't try to appease someone by offering them their favorite objects or distractions in this case, unless it's, a comfort item that can definitely mitigate their distress, because most of the time they're not going to be in a cognitive state where they can appreciate what you're trying to do for them, and it certainly won't be the thing to kind of pull them out of their state of distress. A favorite toy, just like a favorite video game, nothing like that is really going to help them in that state because they're just not in a cognitive state where they can appreciate that. Now, with all of that said, I think it's really important for us to note that interventions and supports for autistic people cannot and should not just occur at the level of the individual. And what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that, just trying to immediately intervene in the moment to prevent or reduce the distress that sensory stimuli can cause and to prevent meltdowns or to respond to meltdowns to de-escalate them once they happen, these are all important and they're all necessary, but they're not where intervention starts and ends, because we should really ask ourselves, why do sensory meltdowns happen for autistic people so often? And the reality is that we have built a world that is not as accepting and supportive of autistic and neurodivergent people in general as it should be. We've built a world full of unnecessarily overwhelming sensory stimuli that prioritizes efficiency over safety, that prioritizes efficiency over comfort, and prioritizes efficiency over the livelihood and well-being of people within it. This is a conscious collective choice that we have made as a society, and it is not inevitable, and it is not natural, and it does not need to go on. The choice is within our hands collectively as a society right here and right now to build a society that does not ruthlessly prioritize efficiency at the cost of the individual's psychological well-being, safety, and most of all, flourishing. And it's not enough to just have words. We see companies these days paying lip service to the ideals of neurodivergence, as if that would ever rectify the fact that autistic people are still treated as second-class citizens by society. Autistic people are regularly demonized and belittled for failing to live up to the perceived standards of efficiency which neurotypical society demands of them, and which capitalist society demands of them. And with that in mind, we need to move towards a society that is not promoting hierarchies, that is not promoting efficiency and profit at the expense of the individual, because only then can we create a world where autistic people can truly be liberated and can flourish. I'd like to just close out my presentation by taking some time to offer my thanks to some important people who have been instrumental in my academic work and my personal progress. So, first of all, I'm just always so grateful to my colleague Caroline. She's been consistently dedicated in the lab. She handles so much responsibility, and she puts in great work to build a rapport with the autistic communities we work with. I learned so much from her direct experience of working with autistic kids. And in my future research, where I hope to work with autistic children more directly myself, I'll always be keeping in mind her empathetic and very personable style of communicating as the just gold standard example to aspire to. And next, I'd like to thank my supervisor and mentor, Professor Dennis Sokodolsky. He's my supervisor here in the lab, and he's always just been so helpful. I'm appreciative of the fact that he handled all the data collection before I got here at Yale, and that allowed me to fully focus my efforts on analyzing the data and working on my thesis. He's given me so much insight into handling the day-to-day work of being an academic and dealing with the practical challenges that come with being part of the field. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Roger Joe for taking the time to put this event together today. Now, Roger has taken a really important initiative, which is to build bridges between the autistic community and autism researchers, which is so crucial because it's important that the community have a say on the research that affects them. And I couldn't be more grateful to Roger for also giving me the platform to speak about this work, which is so important to me. And finally, I'd just like to close out again by offering my thanks to my mum once more. I look forward to many more years of close friendship and academic collaboration with her. And that's all for today. So thank you so much for your time. And just please feel free to ask any questions you have. I know there was a lot we discussed and covered today, so I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and I'm really eager and really looking forward to having a chat about all of that.
That was brilliant. I am so appreciative of the work you're doing. It's the word inspiring gets tossed around too much, but it's inspiring. I can't thank you enough for what you're doing. It gives me hope for our future generations and fills me with joy. So thank you for that. Just a couple of reminders before we start the Q&A. Make sure you're on mute if you're not directly communicating. I'm going to be monitoring the chat. If you want your question or comment read out loud, excuse me, if you could please write the word read in front of your comment or question, that will help me know that you want that shared with everyone. You can use the icon button if you want to raise your hand, which is helpful, or you can wave in the screen. And I think, Sanjay, you can probably see people if they're doing that. Yes? And I would like to start by saying I'm, as an anthropologist, uh, focusing on autistic culture, I'm really fascinated by this interface between the reportage of the parents and the actual autistic kids. Of course, you have this sort of shadow factor that many parents are autistic themselves and haven't necessarily been identified, so there's layers there. But I'm wondering if you actually shared these results directly with the participants, and B, if so, if there were any revelations.
That's a really interesting question, and that's actually not something I personally have insight into because, as I mentioned in the talk, the data collection had actually already kind of concluded by the time I arrived at Yale. So, just for kind of reasons of confidentiality and just, respect for kind of research procedure, I just wasn't able to speak to the participants directly as data collection had concluded, by that point.
We have some questions in the comments. Um,
Oh, I see there's one asking for my email. Let me just put that in the chat so that anyone can contact me.
yeah, there are
Okay.
actually several here. If you're comfortable with me reading one and then you can answer and we'll keep going. If anybody raises their hand, let me know. So first, uh, looking at how Carl Peglau, a psychologist, helped create the now famous Ampleman that enabled a much more charter that I'm trying to read this. I'm not sure I'm getting it. That embrace the everyday. Is there anything contemporary creatives and planners can help enable uh, to help assist them um, with the curb cut effect? I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Do you want to address
Um,
that?
I'm having a read of what said there. I think I get the gist of it. But I think they can chime in if they feel like, misrepresented their question in any way. So I think, I'll close out with the last part of the question about like, so what is your opinion as both a psychologist and also an individual about what could be applied into the future, but also the present day? I don't know about the ample man. I might have to speak more about that afterwards, and I would love to actually. But I guess the gist of the question, as I'm gathering it, is kind of about like, everyday kind of interventions to kind of design of public spaces and things like, or kind of design of signs and public spaces and things like that to kind of make them more neurodiversity friendly. If I'm gleaning that correctly. says they could read the question for me. Would that be all right?
Sure. So what I'm saying there is, how can we embrace the everyday? We've got Karl Pegler who designed El Doberman of East Germany or East Switzerland, and then that's became an iconic symbol of it. But then you've got people like Margaret Culver and Jock Kinnear in the 1960s designing the road system for Britain. Don't get me wrong, everyone uses the road, well, not everyone uses the road, but that's a system of motorway signage and the design. So what things can contemporary creatives, well, can you hear me okay? By the way, can you all hear me okay? So what things can contemporary creatives and designers, not just sort of autistic individuals, but sort of what can we do to embrace this, whether that is through how we do our music posters, whether that is how we, the curve cut effect, that is when you're looking at something that was designed for disabled people that then got used to assist people every day. For example, the street curbs made it so people could cross the road with a pram or a trolley or even a stroller. Well, what do you call it, a stroller in America? The thing that you have a baby inside of. So, thinking that was designed for disabled people with wheelchairs then became part of an assistance for using every day. So, what things can both designers but also future creatives, and people who do every day, but what can they do to embrace that every day so therefore it doesn't just benefit autistic people, it benefits wider society to breed the change you want to see? That's my first question. So, what things can do?
Such a brilliant question. Yeah, brilliant friend of mine, and they always just ask such like thoughtful and like thought-provoking questions. Like that's just something like I would never have even like thought of myself, I suppose, because I don't come from kind of like, an architectural or design background. I think that's and actually my gut reaction like kind of I know it seems like a little bit of a cop out. My gut reaction is kind of like I don't know. And I feel like, this is why I think collaboration is so important because I think, I have my opinions and my feelings and my beliefs as an autism researcher, but I think, I am naturally limited by like the knowledge of my expertise. And that's the thing about like, specializing in a certain discipline is you become very, very familiar with what you know, but it's like a little bit like having blinkers on. You might kind of like lose sight of what people in other disciplines are doing. And I think your question kind of drives home the point of like interdisciplinary collaboration. So I think the first step to address your point would be for architects and designers and artists, as you noted, creatives. I think the first step would be for there to be a stronger and more consistent line of communication between, academics and architects, because then that way, if, an architect has an idea, but they're not sure about whether the idea is going to address the sensory needs of autistic people, then they can go to a researcher and ask them about what the research shows on that. And then, on the flip side, if an autism researcher says, well, we'd really like to design a building or a street in this way in order to meet the sensory needs of autistic people, and then the architect might be able to tell them, okay, but this isn't physically possible, or that, we don't have the resources for this right now, or, the kind of like mechanics that this would require would need to be adjusted in order for it to be practically implementable on a kind of like nationwide level. I think to address your question, I don't have like a conclusive answer to your question, but I think a great first step would be greater interdisciplinary collaboration between designers and artists and the autism researchers and the autistic community themselves, of course. Yeah.
We have a lot of engagement here. So I'm just going to try to read these in order, and I hope I don't miss anyone. I particularly like this question that's just come up. I'm wondering if and how a meltdown differs from a seizure disorder.
That's beyond the limits of my current research knowledge. I wouldn't want to kind of try and, establish that distinction on a very clear-cut level, as I just wouldn't, want to provide false information. My understanding is that they have different causes, but that's about as far as I can kind of go with that right now.
Yeah, I did some cursory reading at one point, and there seems to be some connection, but I can't speak authoritatively on just how. Next question, what does the research suggest about school uniforms or lack thereof as an important aspect in British education? Because it's traditional and a way of showing hierarchy, much more rebelling, I guess, and um, that compared to the United States. And does that help or worsen one's educational experience?
That's a really good question again, and again, just not one I have the knowledge to kind of conclusively answer off the top of my head. I'm not familiar with there's any research literature on that, but if there isn't, there really should be. And the reason why is because, we know that particular kind of items of clothing can be very uncomfortable for autistic people on a sensory level. I know it's not something I personally experienced, but speaking to many autistic friends of mine, I know that they can experience discomfort with things like, particular kind of like tags in their clothing and things like that that can, that sensation, which to a neurotypical person might feel like just barely noticeable, it can register as like extremely and viscerally uncomfortable for somebody on the spectrum. So I think like, I don't have like a very specific response to that question about school uniforms specifically, but what I can speak to is that I know that in terms of the design of clothes and things like that, we certainly kind of need to be moving towards more comfortable materials, more comfortable fabrics, and kind of like perhaps granting a little bit more flexibility to autistic children or teenagers in school in terms, or even in the workplace in terms of, obviously there's a dress code of formality that has to be respected, but if particular items of clothing kind of cause sensory discomfort, I think that there should be a serious discussion around like, okay, well, you don't need to wear this, like you need to wear something that reaches this level of formality, but we're not going to demand that you wear this specific article of clothing that is causing you pain or discomfort. That I think would be a great step to take.
Someone's asking for a link to your study. We'll try to get that up on our social media if that's okay. We can do that afterwards. And let's see. Have you considered doing research with menstruating teens to see how they deal with irritability and how this affects us? A great question. Hormonal changes definitely affect this
Um,
person and all of us for sure.
That's a really brilliant point, and I did see that comment earlier, and I was just like, "That's absolutely essential." Like, in my view, that's not even like a choice. That's in terms of like, have I considered it? It's like I've considered it, and I know that it's just yes, like it 100% has to be done because I think that the needs of autistic women and girls, as well as transmasculine people who experience menstruation as well, have just been completely overlooked, completely neglected, and I think there's so many for sensory reasons, but also for kind of like reasons of social exclusion. Autistic women, girls, and transmasculine people can really struggle with that in their teenage years. And I think it's so important that we kind of destigmatize that, that we kind of create research to understand their experiences. And I think, that should involve kind of, I guess, like, biological measures and things like that so that we can as you noted like understand the kind of hormonal processes going on, but I think also it would also need to kind of involve qualitative research. So for anyone unfamiliar with that term, qualitative research just means like data that is not a set of numbers or numerical outcomes. Qualitative data is when you get lots of words, which just rich text-based detail about people's experiences. And that can be done through things like interviews, it can be done through focus groups. So I think qualitative research would need to form a cornerstone of that research into autistic experiences of menstruation, simply because, it's an under-researched area that we don't yet understand very well. And when you're beginning with an area you don't understand very well, you need to hear about it in the words of the people who are experiencing it. By giving them a predefined measure, you're limiting the scope of what they can say to what that measure says. And while that's sometimes necessary for reasons of clinical efficiency, when we're starting out with an area that we don't understand very well, we need to just fully let people express themselves in their own words and then look at that data and try to say, what is the data telling us, rather than going into it with our own presuppositions, which in a patriarchal society will naturally reflect gendered stereotypes and norms.
Yeah, I just wanted to address some of the folks who had their hands up for a while. You want to say something?
Oh, hello. Yes. I also wrote it in chat. So, really great presentation. I'm an autistic adult and I'm a psychologist and I practice predominantly in diagnostic assessment, so autism being a primary focus. And I'm quite limited in terms of like performance-based test choice and things like that. It has to always be gold standard. But I'm just wondering in terms of screening measures, if you have any particular items that you'd kind of say are pretty good at capturing nuanced presentations. Specifically, I'm interested in the processing one that you had reference to earlier, but I didn't catch the name. So yes, thank you.
Okay, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I'm gonna like nerd out here, so thank you for asking me that question. Um, so you were curious about you said the processing measure is what I'm understanding you're referring to there was the adolescent adult sensory profile. Is that the one you were referring?
Oh, yes, okay.
I do have my criticisms of his work, but Simon Baron Cohen, who's quite a prominent autism researcher, I think he did recently kind of develop, well, I say recently, I think it was about in 2014, he developed a new measure that aimed to kind of capture some of these features. And I think it is in many ways an improvement upon the previous measures because of the fact that they very deliberately made an effort to kind of distinguish what might be an emotional or anxiety based response from a kind of pure sensory function. So the measure is intended to kind of deliberately exclude items that would measure emotional responses or anxiety based responses to measures that would purely measure the way that somebody is responding on a purely sensory level.
I really appreciate that. And do I have time to ask one more very quick follow-up to that? I'm personally happy with that, yeah. Okay, perfect. So there are like so many broad, really specific examples of how all of these different neurodivergent, nuanced ways of like, bottom-up theory and stuff work. So like even measures that capture what those experiences look like day to day, for instance, like do you have difficulty reading an analog clock or something like that from all of the different schools or like areas of functioning and stuff collectively? Do you know of anything that's like that, or is that something that is needing to be established and a blind spot?
That's a really, really thoughtful question. I That needs to be established because to my knowledge, nothing like that currently exists. I was going to say though, I just wanted to provide because you asked me about if there were any sensory processing screening measures, and I realized I didn't say the specific name of the measure that was developed by Baron Cohen because I couldn't recall the name of it, but I've just looked it up and it's called the sensory perception quotient.
Oh, thank you. So,
Oh wait, sorry, I'll put it in the chat. There we go.
so that's
And see, I've just put the link in the chat, so if you'd like to read a little bit more, you can follow up on that more recent measure that was designed to address that critique that I mentioned earlier. In terms of the more specific suggestions you made about difficulties with things like reading like an analog clock, that I actually don't know of any measures that would measure that construct. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I just mean that I personally can't. I've never read about that off the top of my head. Yeah.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you, and really great work.
Your questions were incredibly thoughtful, and I think, I'll certainly be kind of recording them and keeping a note of them for my future reference because they're going to guide and direct the reading that I do from here. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
I want to be sure to get to question because had a bit of a time today with getting in and getting noticed. So, question: what considerations do you or any researchers need to look at affective-based questioning, where parents could answer a very different perspective on the child's quote state versus what is actually going on? I'm thinking of children with alexithymia or interoception differences where they have no idea what is going on or can describe their irritability.
Could I have a chance to just, I appreciate you reading the question. I might just also like to read it if that's okay, just so I can kind of take the time to process the meaning of each individual part of the question. Because, oh, I think I found it. Is it the one about alexithymia Yes, okay, I found the
Yeah.
question. Yep, okay. Parents could answer a very different perspective on what the child's. Okay, that's a really good question. And I think, luckily here we're not having to work kind of from scratch, like in this case, like existing research offers us a template for like how we can kind of study those paradigms. So to speak to your question, you kind of say like, what do we do when, a parents could answer a very different perspective on what the child's state versus what is actually going on, and children with alexithymia or interoception differences. Well, that's we're lucky here because we kind of have like a precedent for this kind of thing. So one way is to use things like, skin conductance responses, like EEG responses, things like that, because what you're dealing with there is even things like heart rate. It's all useful data because these are objective kind of biological markers. And so what we can do is there's been some previous research that has kind of allowed us to offer, how to say, like we've been able to study how closely adolescent self-report aligns with the physiological processes that are going on in their body, and how closely parent report aligns with the physiological responses that are going on in their child's body. And what we've tended to find from that research is that adolescents usually report with more accuracy on their own sensory processing, sorry, their own anxiety. That work hasn't been done with sensory processing yet, but it has been done with anxiety. We find that autistic children and teenagers tend to report with greater accuracy their own subjectively experienced symptoms of anxiety in relation to objective physiological markers than their parents do when their parents try to describe what they think is going on with their autistic teenager. So I think, to answer your question about alexithymia and interoception differences, we could kind of build on that work that's already been done to examine correspondence or lack thereof between self-reported anxiety and physiological measures of anxiety. We could expand on that work and extend it to specifically hone in on looking at children with alexithymia and interoception. I hope that answers your question, but like I understand if not, because this is really, really complex and I don't have all the answers yet.
Sanjay, hi, it is. Hi, I'm finally online. Thank you so much. Yes, that does answer this. This is a huge kind of rabbit hole I'm going down for my research. And to extend it, it's similar to the question in terms of screening. You have teachers. I'm kind of going into and working with K to 12, so students. So you have the teacher doing the screening for some diagnostic screen, etc. assessments. And the common thing I always hear is, "Oh, they look fine. They look fine. They're fine." No, they're not. So there's a whole complexity there. Anyway, but I'm just fascinated by, as I uncover more and more about, again, the physiological side of being human, right? And the phenomenological side of that, of just, what am I feeling? And then there are these, again, named conditions, just because we've had to put a label on these things like alexithymia or thymia, and how it, I can't describe how I feel. I've never been able to look at emotion charts and look at a face and all of those things, like, how are you feeling? Don't ask that. Get rid of emotion. I mean, emotion charts have their point. I'm going off topic here, but do you know what I mean? So the child itself versus what the parent's seeing, and also the bias of the the parent, of, how they answer these is very subjective. I again, just in my own experience anyway, I can't say for everything, but it's just, we need to consider, oh, well, the parent said this, the teacher said this, they're fine, they don't get a diagnosis, but the child is struggling, and they are trying to communicate something. And so I love that, yes, when you get into like the skin conductivity, the EEG, I apologize if this was also in your talk today, because I missed half of it, but I'd love to get further information. But thank you very much, that answered the question. Thanks, Don, for jumping in.
Thank you. That was a really great question. And no, don't worry, you actually didn't miss anything in that regard because I actually didn't have time to speak about these physiological measures or neuroimaging measures in the talk today. I kind of deliberately omitted it just for the sake of brevity and time to give everybody enough time to kind of ask all the questions they wanted to. But I was hoping somebody would ask a question that would like allow me to address it, and you did. So thank you.
Do you want to go next?
I think the question came before mine. My question was dropped in chat basically at the end of the presentation. I'm in no rush, but would like to get reached eventually. Okay, okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, Sanjay, this is amazing. You have a tremendous, beautiful, and wonderful way of communicating something that you obviously are deeply passionate and knowledgeable about. So I just want to start with that because this is incredible. And I have a young person in my house. Both of my children were diagnosed. They're young adults now, but one is only 20. So all of this is still very close to home for me. And all of the questions are spot on about the instruments, the screening. Yes, 100%. Yes. So, but my work, I'm an anthropologist, so I also really appreciate the nod to qualitative research, and starting with stories. And my work really centers around, basically, in a nutshell, taking people like us seriously in the first place. My work is specifically on invalidation and mental health and well-being and belonging, but it's really about epistemic justice in the first place, and the fact that none of us take us at our word when we say, hey, I'm struggling. So my question is really about when you stretch that question out to the broader, what I call autism world. So you've got different camps, right? You've got parents in the quote unquote, I'm going to scare quotes because I don't know how people feel about this whole thing, but the profound camp, right? And all of that argument that's very hot right now, and the divide between them and like autistic self-advocates that are calling for different things. And from my point of view, and I looked at the funding to say, hey, look, no, like this whole like funding scarcity thing, that's affecting all of us because the money isn't really flowing to any of us directly. It's just elite capture in certain contexts, right? So let's get on the same page and understand one another that there's work to be done. So that's where my mind goes when I hear this about how do you connect the direct self-report that comes from being an autistic person, right, with what parents think their child is experiencing, and also the beefing that happens between quirky TikTokers and parents, of children with different needs, to say, hey, both of these things are real. Both of these things have challenges. Can we understand one another just by recognizing things like you just said, that the teen's self-reports more accurately tracked with even what you call scientific measures of reality, right? So there's a validation of that insider knowledge and expertise right there. So can that bridge, in part, perhaps, this divide? Thank you. Sorry, that was long and convoluted.
No, don't worry. I mean, I think the very nature of what we're studying is complex. So, asking a convoluted question is unavoidable, and I do the same thing all the time. Yeah, so to speak to your question, I think the first, let me know if by the end of the time I finish speaking, if you feel like I still haven't addressed your point, like
You actually
follow up with me about that. Like I'm actively inviting that. Like I don't want to give you kind of like a disingenuous answer. Um, so I think to speak to one of the parts of your question that particularly stuck out to me, which was about kind of like, recognizing the distinct needs of different subsections of the autistic community and, and you use that term profound autism and like, I personally am not like, offended by that term. I just sort of kind of like question its utility because I'm kind of like, well, what we originally described as autism is now being described as profound autism because it feels like the goalposts and definitions have shifted slightly. And then with that in mind, to speak to another one of your points, in my opinion, part of why the goalposts and definitions have shifted significantly is precisely because autism has become such a strong part of the cultural zeitgeist. Now, we need only to look to the front page of TikTok to see the fact that autism is now considered an attractive consumer identity, and in fact is in some cases a very disturbing trend which has recently begun to be fetishized, particularly in autistic women and girls. And we need to push back on this at every turn, not only because of the fact that it's morally wrong, but also because of the fact that it represents an empirical obfuscation, which is going to impair our ability to accurately understand autism as a phenomenon. So I think in terms of that, I see no particular need for the term profound autism because it's just autism to me.
the
the quirky TikTokers, as you put it, kind of represent another trend, which, in my opinion, does not necessarily represent the lived experience of the majority of autistic people.
Now, there's
Particular reasons why that trend of self-diagnosis is occurring, and I'm not here to condemn anybody nor to judge anybody. I think it's more of a reflection of the symptoms of modernity and of, a late capitalist society where people are increasingly alienated and they're looking for a sense of meaning. And often we try to find meaning in identities, and I think autism happens to be that identity for many people. But we need to draw a meaningful distinction between people who are gravitating towards autism as an attractive consumer identity and people who are significantly impaired by autism. Because the fact remains that even with a social model of disability where we recognize, objectively speaking, that the society we have built is terrible for autistic people, there are still inherent difficulties that come with being autistic.
if we build a
Utopia overnight, autistic people would still struggle and they would still need consistent support that is specifically tailored to them. I don't know if that, feel free to follow up if you had anything else about your question that you wanted to address, but I think as a final point, I will also say those people who are self-diagnosed with autism because they saw it on TikTok, that they still need like support because there's clearly a reason why they did that. They probably, like as I noted, this is a response to alienation and it's a response to a search for meaning and identity. And if you're searching in that way for meaning and identity, you're clearly still struggling with something. And I think this is actually an idea I had for a PhD proposal that I wrote where I submitted it to UCL and it was actually accepted, but I'm choosing not to pursue that at this time. This particular PhD proposal would have investigated what are the factors driving self-identification with autism and trying to empirically substantiate to what extent does social media play a role? And I think, if we can understand the contribution of social media, then we can begin to disentangle the different reasons why we're seeing such a large uptake in self-identification with autism. And this isn't about condemning or judging anyone or calling anybody an attention seeker, because as I said, I think the people who are self-diagnosing, possibly even mistakenly self-diagnosing, I still think they need support and they still need empathy, but it's just the nature of their difficulties are qualitatively different from people with autism.
yeah. So thank you for all of that. Thank you for all of that. Dawn, sorry, were you speaking?
I just, we generally have a hard stop at an hour and a half because I begin to crumble personally. So I didn't mean to slow your roll there. Really patient about getting this question read, and I think this is going to be about all I can do today. I would encourage
Sanjay, if
you can scroll up in the chat because I'm having some trouble processing up to question. It says read bringing back because they actually tried twice to get that on there. Can you scroll up and read that?
Yep. Let me have a look. Okay. Oh, yes, I see it. Yes. Okay. So, okay, let's have a look here. So, differences between self-report and parent-report in teens as data. Do you know if that's approach that's been? Okay, yeah, I'll just read the question. So, unless you like to read it yourself, or do you want me to read it? I'm easygoing either way, but just let me know.
reading out loud is one of the hardest kinds of speech for me. I can paraphrase or you can read, and I don't care.
Okay, I'll maybe read it then, just to reflect the kind of precision of your original wording, because I can see that you've been very intentional about the words that you've used. Okay, so differences between self-report and parent-report in teens. Oh, sorry, I just clicked something. As data is a really interesting idea to me. Do you know if that's an approach that has been taken in other areas or with other measures, like communication? Or taking that difference across other roles as data, like self versus teacher or self versus therapist? Is multi-site recruitment a feasible option for getting more participants here? Regarding meltdowns, there's also often a period where the person isn't actively melting down anymore, but they're also not actually ready to get up or do stuff again. Different advice for that recovery time versus the meltdown itself. Okay, so these are some really thoughtful and engaging questions. So I'm just going to kind of try to take the time to address each one individually. Um, Okay, let me just have a think for 1 second, and then because I just want to kind of like think through what I'm going to say. Yes, so to your first question, I do believe that approach of self-report versus parent report has been taken across those other areas, like with communication or like self versus teacher and things like that. There's definitely a lot of data on that, with regard to core autistic. If it's been done with sensory processing, people will have done it with the more kind of like perceived core autistic symptoms, like the communication differences that characterize autism. I'm not personally able to speak to the results of that work myself, just because it's not something that I've looked into, but I can almost like guarantee you that that is out there. The stuff about self versus therapist is very interesting, and I don't know about that actually. I hope that work has been done because it's very important, but if not, it should be done, because I think, autistic people can we're not a monolith, but we can have particular kind of preferences for certain styles of communication. And I think like things like therapy speak, like setting boundaries or self-care or just these kinds of terms, perhaps they might be a little bit kind of like vague for some autistic people. Perhaps some autistic people might require more kind of concrete language in those situations. And for that reason, I think it would be very interesting to do a study in particular on kind of like autistic person and their therapist, kind of comparisons in their perceptions of things. That would be very important, very valuable work to do. To speak to your second point, is multi-site recruitment a feasible option for getting more participants here? Multi-site recruitment is absolutely integral to our strategy there. We're working, here at Yale, we're in fact, we're really kind of relying on our collaborators here. We're trying to take the lead, but we're also relying on our collaborators because no one university can do it alone, because otherwise you just simply can't recruit the numbers of people that you need in order to have a representative sample that is diverse and represents the autistic community as we know it to be. So multi-site recruitment is not only feasible, but also necessary. There needs to be a lot more money put into this. Um, Regarding meltdowns, there's also often a period where the person isn't actively melting down anymore, but they're also not actually ready to get up or do stuff again. Different advice for that recovery time versus the meltdown itself. That's a really good question. I'm just going to be honest and say I just don't have the answer to that right now. I wouldn't want to give clinical advice that would be end up being misapplied in any way. I think it's probably quite likely that in her book, Deborah Lipsky addresses this, the From Anxiety to Meltdown book. I'll put the name of that in the chat because I can see my background blur is sort of blocking it out, but I will just put that in the chat because I would encourage everyone to check out that book. I imagine she probably has advice on that, but I wasn't able to revisit that particular section in advance of this talk today. So I would encourage anyone who has the time to go and read that book because it's like not very long. It's 236 pages and it's written in a very accessible style. So I'd refer to Deborah Lipsky's book for more information on that. Okay,
Okay, I'll
I
just
think
jump
that's
in
everything.
here and yeah, and let people know to um, go to our social media platforms to find more information about upcoming events. On Facebook, you want to scroll over to the event tab, click that, and then we have a whole list of things coming up. If you can register, that's very helpful for us to get you the information that you need to get in. You can always join Eventbrite and meet up for a kind of a speedy pathway to that end. And again, as I mentioned in the chat, we heartily encourage people to continue the discussion on our social media platforms. If you go underneath, for example, today, the advertisement for Sanjay's talk, we can continue to connect there, continue the discussion. Any unanswered questions you can put up there, and Sanjay can come back around and look at those. And yeah,
Yeah.
just brilliant. I so appreciate everything, Sanjay.
Thank you so much, and like, yeah, thank you for everyone taking the time to like come out and really attend this. I wasn't expecting to see such a big turnout. It made me feel very happy, very grateful, and like I I think that, coming out here today and speaking to people who work directly with autistic kids and people who are autistic themselves today is just exactly what my priority was. And I'm really, really just immensely grateful for everyone's thoughtful questions. You all asked things that I would just never have thought to ask myself. And I think that's exactly what I wanted out today because I don't ever want to be in like, an echo chamber of people who don't challenge me or people who don't get me to think about things that I wouldn't otherwise think about. And you all brought different perspectives. You all encouraged me to to think more critically and reflectively about current gaps in my knowledge. And that to me is one of the most important and valuable things. And I'm so grateful to everyone who was in attendance today. I think I might have to wrap up soon if that's all right, just because I'm finding I'm a little bit at kind of like a social capacity right now. But I think, that doesn't change the fact I'm immensely grateful for everyone's time and for everyone asking such thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Yeah, I'm told.
Thank you. I'm toast. I've got to go. But yeah, I agree. I'd like to strengthen our program in that area and do more collaborative work like this. So thank you again, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.